December just started a couple hours ago. So
yeah, it's like this year was like 25 minutes ago. Yeah, I don't like it. I need time to process in like orderly fashion.
100%. Well, speaking of that and the inevitable march of time, let's go ahead and jump in for getting this party started for upgrading to Windows 11, what folks need to know to be ready for it. So good morning. I'm Will McPhee, president of System Support. Still interesting to be able to say that after, having my father retire. But today we are going over Microsoft has announced the end of Windows 10. And so we're going to Windows 11. Some machines already have it, some don't. And so we're going over the needs to know before we get anywhere. All right. So first piece of what you need to know is the deadline. Hey, when do you have to do it by? And if you don't meet the deadline, what happens, right? Deadlines are there for a reason. There's usually a consequence to it. So you want to go through for what that is. You need to know if your machines are ready and how to know if the machine that you have is ready to go. And then, of course, how much is this whole thing going to cost? All right, so let's go ahead and jump in for what's the deadline? October 2025. So per Microsoft, Windows 10 reaches end of support October 14th, 2025. What does this mean? No more software updates for the Windows 10 operating system. So Microsoft is saying we're not fixing anything, providing any updates. We're not doing anything with Windows 10 anymore. And that's for Home, Pro, any of the Windows 10 operating systems. All right, so what happens on October 15th, 2025? So your PC will still work. However, if down the road any new security vulnerabilities are identified, they're not going to be patched. Same for any performance problems, any bugs, anything that comes up. So if there's something like, hey, we noticed that there's an issue with this new printer driver and it has this problem, Microsoft's not going to fix it. They're not going to do anything for fixing it. They're just going to say, hey, we let you know you needed to make it to Windows 11. To be perfectly honest, for your home computer, laptop that you've got at home, family computer, probably fine to be Windows 10 for a little while longer as you wait to maybe buy a new computer for the home or anything like that. But for businesses, you really want to be on top of it because the lack of the patches can pose some serious security problems. And 9 out of 10 experts, if you put a gun to their head and go, hey, what's the most important thing I can do to make sure that my system is secure? It's applying patches, because these are things that are fundamentally wrong with the operating system that no security software thing is really going to fix it for you. And the last piece too, kind of hitting home on that for if you don't update it, is hey, that vulnerability is going to come out. They always come out. And you've opened the door for security problems that they can just get around this security software. Print Nightmare is a great example. So there was an issue that the folder where printer drivers are installed on a computer, you could run programs in that folder with almost no restriction. So if a attacker got a file in there, they could do really whatever they wanted on the computer. So Microsoft fixed that with a patch, but going forward, they won't do stuff like that. So that's why you really want to make sure that you get up to Windows 11, is just to make sure that you're getting an operating system that's being patched. So what happens if you really put it off? And I mean, really, really let time go by? From this wonderful graphic that Ryan had found. Definitely, much like the Apple there, things kind of start to fall apart on the computer as time really extends if you put off that upgrade. So the big one that we see is software compatibility. So, newer software is going to be unsupported on Windows 10 after a while. And I'm talking you're putting it off for a year or two. So companies that release versions of theirs that are always releasing new versions and updates, think Adobe, Dropbox, Google Drive, Google Chrome, a lot of those type of providers, they're going to say, hey, this operating system's not supported. You can't install this on this. I see that the most with QuickBooks Desktop. Now, granted, QuickBooks has its own end of life thing that's going on, but I have seen that, hey, if you're not keeping up to date, QuickBooks will say, we're not installing the software on this computer. The operating system's out of date and we're not doing this. And a lot of developers too use it as a reason to say, we're not going to support the older versions of the software. We're not fixing bugs. We're not fixing security flaws. Things might not talk to each other correctly. So we're just not doing this. And that kind of leads into they're just not supporting it. As it gets older and older, if something goes wrong with it, that's it. I'll pick on QuickBooks again. If you're using QuickBooks 2019 into its position as, hey, that's 5 years old. If your company file crashes, we're not helping you. I'm sorry. Good luck. And again, kind of hitting home, a lack of update and patches just leaves you open to vulnerabilities. Things can really start to go wrong. Now, this is something that kind of meshes a little bit with, hey, the operating system needs to be upgraded. That's also kind of a warning sign of, hey, your hardware might be getting up there in age as well. So, an older operating system, if you're trying to run Windows 10 on like a really new machine because you like the way it's laid out, there might be some things on the hardware that you can't take advantage of, specifically for some driver performance, some onboard security pieces, so that if you bought a machine within the past year, it's the latest and greatest, you want to run Windows 10 on it, you could run into some performance issues on that front. And then also too, speaking of, again, for like running old operating systems on newer hardware, you could start getting a thing where the hardware can't talk to the operating system through the driver. The whole what is a driver thing might be an interesting summer webinar for, hey, where do these words come from? And why is it called bus? Why is it called driver? And actually here's your hint as to why it's called that. But again, if you keep trying to use old operating system on new hardware, you can have problems there. And then again, especially if you're trying to like limp a machine along, getting replacements for the older parts becomes difficult. Especially this is mostly for manufacturing firms or firms that maybe they use a specific piece of equipment to program a radio or something like that. You want to make sure those are updated because, hey, okay, now we have Windows 11 and it turns out there was this piece of software that to program this radio and it needs this certain driver and that driver's not supported because it turns out it's wildly insecure. So this doesn't work. So keeping up with these operating system updates is a big piece of making sure that things work as expected, because everything, all the hardware, the software, the way the hardware talks to the software, there's so many moving parts that it's not just a single thing. I mean, even just thinking of like the mouse, the difference between the USB plug and play of, just plug the USB into a random port versus the dedicated ports that used to be for mice once upon a time. And then, hey, okay, I have this mouse that was like a 3D drafting mouse, and now that thing can't plug into the machine because it had a certain port. Taking a hard look at hardware every 4 to 5 years is really important, just to make sure that there's not something that becomes a show-stopping event of, oh my God, this thing's not going to be able to do its job in 4 years. This leads cleanly into obsolescence. So, if you're hanging on to an old piece of software, you're going to be losing access to software and hardware over time. There may be things that you can't do anymore. I have one particular client that has a database that was written in the year 2000 that is having serious performance issues. And that's more an obsolescence on the age of the machine. But we can't update the operating systems because we don't know if that software will run on the new operating systems. And so they're kind of hanging in time. And there's a lot of problems. I mean, I think that thing has an issue every 4 or 5 days. So it keeps our help desk busy. But most of it is just when it happens, it's, hey, this is all right. Everything has to shut down. We restart it. We hope it works. If it doesn't work, a guy in Pennsylvania fixes it. And that's really kind of the core of what obsolescence looks at. So you're just looking for those things that, hey, if in my business, this thing that I use every day or every quarter or once a year, if it doesn't do its job, what are my alternative plans here? Because just so much of IT now is just straight risk management. Hey, this is the thing I'm doing day to day, and what do I need to do to make sure that what I'm doing still goes? And especially too, kind of not so much on the risk management, maybe a little bit on the gain. New developments and features, improving quality of life. The push for AI, I mean, if for those that playing on your bingo cards at home, for how long was it going to take until it was mentioned? You've got 13 minutes before I finally mentioned AI. So AI is going to require a lot of horsepower in order to crunch the numbers to make sure that it's going to do the things that it does. And I've mentioned it in some of the other webinars that AI is going to be a It's effectively going to be a junior in college level of intelligence intern that's going to be like a personal assistant. And the idea is to give that AI as much information as possible and as much scope so that it gets the context of what you're trying to do. And where that's going is on the computers themselves, which would be the Copilot enabled PCs. Now, Microsoft is starting to roll out some of those now, but I like to wait a little bit on the new features. Like they had a whole push for augmented reality and they rolled that back. So I think they're going to pull it off eventually, but let's give them a little more time to work out the kinks before we get there. But it's important to note that if you want that type of stuff, hardware upgrades and operating system upgrades are a requirement. And then kind of hitting home to that risk piece, the longer you wait to repair or update a legacy device, software package, or anything, you're accruing what's called technical debt. And as I mentioned, picking on that client from before, the amount of data that's there, what you have to move, the overhaul that you have to do just becomes more and more and more painful, maybe in actual dollars and cents of like, hey, you got to pay for a whole new server, you got to pay for a whole new database design, you got to pay, you got to pay, you got to pay. And some of it might just be technical debt of, hey, things are connected in a really junky way and unraveling it's going to take a lot of effort, a lot of time, or a lot of relearning. And it's more effort than it is actual checks that you write out of the bank account. So so some of that is looking at processes. And again, the operating system, kind of like the new year, is a great reminder to take a look at these type of things. So let's get ready to rumble. How do you know if your machine is ready for that update? How do you know if the hardware that you have can just make the jump if you're fine, or if, hey, it's time to ask Santa for a new business desktop? So Windows 11 does have some unique hardware requirements beyond the typical RAM CPU storage. Most of the machines we run into are just fine for RAM CPU and storage. This would be really, really small, light machines that have like minimum computation requirements. So those really aren't a factor. One of the big ones is Secure Boot, so that the way that the machine turns on and loads the operating system requires a certain driver, and it's built into the BIOS, which is a fancy way of saying the motherboard that's in there has to be of a certain caliber in order to be able to handle the way it locks a few things down when the machine starts up. And then the big one, which we see overwhelmingly is the deciding factor, is something called the TPM chip, Trusted Platform Module. So it's an actual chip soldered onto the motherboard, and the device handles a lot of the cryptographic. So this is the actual like number storage encryption things that happen for the computer. It stores a lot of those keys in that Trusted Platform Module so that your hardware becomes part of your logon process. This really hits home for Microsoft 365 stuff. So what we've seen in the field of like, do you really need this TPM chip? I guess that's just like a thing that they're trying to push. When a TPM chip has a corruption, it completely nukes the Microsoft 365 services on your computer. So if you're using 365 for Word, Excel, PowerPoint, for your email, that TPM chip goes down. You can't log into any of those services on the computer. You have to go through the web, which is okay for a little while. But if the typical way you work is Outlook, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Teams, OneDrive, SharePoint, that's a show-stopping event because your account can't authenticate. You effectively have to reset the chip, reintroduce the login, and it takes about 2 hours. So we actually had to do that yesterday. It is a hardware component. Hardware components fail. We manage over 900 computers, so anything that can happen usually will happen. So we have seen this TPM chip go a couple times. It usually goes on older machines because the TPM chip has been showing up in the past 5 years of manufacture. So for rules of thumb of is your machine okay? If your machine's manufactured in the past 5 years, chances are it has UEFI firmware in the TPM 2.0 and should be just fine for going up to Windows 10. Older machines, past 5 years, 6 years, I was thinking 2018 and above, it might not have the TPM chip and won't really be able to play nice with how that security is handled. So you can get it to run, but you might have issues with 365 wraps randomly signing out, profiles getting corrupted, and just a lot of things related to you being able to log into your computer. But also, we're talking about like how old a machine is. I've kind of hit on some obsolescence and picked on some software. So this upgrade definitely goes beyond just like, hey, does the hardware have the components and the horsepower to be able to, you know, do what you need to do? Certain programs might not be ready for Windows 11. Now, most of your major software vendors, Chrome, Google, Adobe, QuickBooks, pretty much any of the stuff you'd see on TV, they're probably going to be just fine for Windows 11 and have been ready for it. And I wouldn't be surprised if they're ready for Windows 12. So the ones that you really want to be careful of are custom made applications supported by smaller software vendors. So this is like, hey, it's a small team of 5 people out of New Hampshire. That's one to kind of think of, thinking of like, the program HydroCAD is a guy in New Hampshire, might want to check in on him and say, hey, are we good for Windows 11? Although I'm sure it is. The entire industry rests on him. And then, other ones that might be custom made is just, is there anything we need to do to make sure this is going to play nice? And again, that's usually you start hearing the word custom, call the vendor, make sure that there's something saying for like, yeah, it'll be supported, just like no problem. The flip side to it, or major software versions, is if they're wildly out of date. Adobe Acrobat 7, QuickBooks 99, those might not play nice in the new operating system. And so those ones, you'll want to get to the new version of whatever those softwares are. And while paying for a subscription can suck, and I get it, it's a lot of money, but making sure that things are up to date and working are a big part of it. That whole update thing is a balancing act. And then the good news, if something's browser based, it should be just fine. All you need to do is launch the web browser and it's good to go. So for making sure your machines are ready, is it made within the past 5-6 years? If we manage your machines, we can check really quick to see if you have that TPM chip and that UEFI boot. For most of our clients, we are at 4 years starting to talk about replacing hardware. So, we start putting that on people's radars just to make sure, because even that, 4 or 5 years go by, performance starts to degrade. It's not like life is getting any less demanding. So we want to make sure that hardware is keeping up with the demands of the job. So, checking that, but the ones that we don't have control over is the software. So, hey, double checking on those softwares and making sure those packages are going to play nice on the new operating system. All right, time to talk dollars and cents. So how much is this going to cost? So when we did Windows 7 to Windows 10, we had to buy the license for $100 a machine. And the good news is, because after when Microsoft played a whole game of how Windows 10 is the last operating system you'll ever need, and blah, 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 and surprise, here's Windows 11. Windows 10 Pro and Home licenses work for 11, so you don't have to buy the license, which is a huge relief. You can just do the upgrade. The only thing that it might cost is just the time it takes to perform. So it's pretty easy to do. A lot of machines for Windows 10 will even have a program that checks if your machine is ready to go to Windows 11, and we'll do the check for you to see if you have the necessary components, necessary drivers, and all that. But really, for the way we're doing it, it is a script. We run it after hours for work, and then we will still put human eyes on the process to make sure that when the machine wakes up and it has the upgrade, that there's no unexpected behavior, or if it has some type of error that, we put eyes on it and give it a whack again to make it finish through. And then how much does it cost? If you don't have the TPM chip or the hardware just doesn't support it, the cost is a new machine. Yes. So the good news is you do it yourself, absolutely free. You have us do it. It's just the labor to do it. And then if it doesn't have the hardware to support it, well, you're gonna get a new rig. So next steps, really simple. Check the age of your machines. If you have questions and we manage your machines, let us know. More than happy to send a report of, hey, what's the age of the machines? We check based on the serial numbers and then have the vendors tell us when they ship the machine. Any machines 5 years old and older, plan to replace them. Some of it, not necessarily just the TPM pieces, but performance, just making sure that, hey, I'm not going to have some nasty, hardware performance problem down the road. You want to pick when you go through the pain of changing machines. Don't let the machine pick when you go through that pain. Much easier to plan it for a slow Thursday in March than to suddenly have it right at the deadline for a quarterly filing. Take an inventory of the programs and applications you use. Again, if it's major software vendors or browser-based, you're just fine. If there's a custom-made thing that you have, check in with the vendor, see if it's supported for Windows 11. We got 10 months to go, so it's plenty of time. And then and just make sure we can run stuff after hours to make sure that productivity stays high and people aren't sitting there staring at waiting for updates to go through. And the last piece too, for like why you don't want to put it off, and hey, for the patching thing, okay, I really don't want to go for it. The other big business risk item that I neglected to mention is that on a ton of cyber insurance applications, even the like one pager ones that usually just do like a quick $500,000 of coverage, which really isn't enough. The applications will always ask, are you using supported operating systems and are they fully patched? Because again, it's just table stakes. It's the same level of you need to do this as making sure multi-factor is enabled for the email or any type of remote access has multi-factor. So if you don't do this and an insurance renewal comes up, you have a Windows 10 machine in your environment, that's cause for the insurance company to say, hey, look at that. We don't have to do a thing. Or no, we're not giving you a policy. Again, kind of talking about IT is now more about a risk management conversation rather than a digital plumbing. Having that insurance is there because nobody plans to have a fire, right? But we still have the appropriate insurances there in case something happens, and breaches start at the $350,000 mark based on just if you have staff and you have their social security number and maybe you just have a file somewhere for when you were hiring them and the background check and the information there. It's just breaches are expensive. Insurance is a necessary part of it. And making sure the operating systems are up to date and patched is part and parcel to make sure that you reduce the real risk of not having a vulnerability out there, and that if God forbid something does happen, you have the insurance to come in and be able to help clean up. So with that, any questions out there on making sure that questions out there for good old Windows 10? It is a great time to pin me down. That's all the phones are off and
yeah. It's just like, oh, we've been waiting for hearing back on you for a week on this. Like, just now you're on camera.
Oh, the nice part too, especially is I understand too if that was like I'm not 100% sure what you had talked about for that entire time, but hopefully people didn't go to sleep through the whole thing. But and for most of it, we'll be meeting with clients individually to go over how things should be set up. So that's most of it. Again, we've been good for keeping people on up-to-date machines, and for those who aren't, probably know who you are. So,
all right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us, and have happy holidays.
Happy holidays, everybody.